At dawn on September 12, 1683, the hills west of Vienna trembled beneath the hooves of 18,000 cavalrymen. In one thunderous descent, they smashed through the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever sent into Europe, an army that had besieged Vienna for 60 days, starved its people and dug tunnels beneath its walls. By sunset, the banner of the Prophet Muhammad, carried into battle by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, lay trampled in the mud. Imagine standing inside those walls, hearing cannon fire echo through the night, rationing your last crumbs of bread, praying the city would not fall before dawn. For those inside Vienna, surrender meant slavery or death. For the rest of Europe, defeat meant the end of Christendom's frontier. How did a starving city, outnumbered nearly 3-1, survive? And how did a hastily assembled coalition led by the King of Poland, John III Sobieski, turn despair into one of the most decisive victories in European history? Stay until the end, because what saved Vienna wasn't just courage. It was timing, leadership, and a single calculated decision that changed the fate of an empire. If history's turning points captivate you, subscribe to Disturbing Tale, where every victory and downfall is told through the eyes of time itself. When you look at a map of Europe in the late 17th century, Vienna doesn't appear vast or imposing. Yet in 1683, that city was the narrow gate between empires. The Danube River carved through its heart, a natural artery linking the Balkans to Central Europe. Whoever commanded Vienna could move men and supplies along that river, straight into the German states. For the Ottoman Empire, whose armies had advanced steadily north for 3 centuries, Vienna was not merely another fortress, it was the key that could open the doors to the continent. To understand the stakes, we have to look backward. In 1529, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the most powerful monarch of his age, had already tried to seize Vienna. He brought an army that terrified Europe, more than 100,000 men with heavy artillery and siege engineers who had mastered the art of reducing cities to dust. Yet that earlier siege failed. Autumn rains flooded his camps, disease took the men, and the long Ottoman supply lines broke under their own weight. Suleiman withdrew, vowing to return. The failure left a scar, an unfinished conquest that haunted the empire for a century and a half. By the 1680s, the Ottoman world was still vast, stretching from Algiers to Baghdad, from the Crimean steppes to the Red Sea. Its borders enclosed more than 3 million square kilometers of territory, its sultans ruling over millions of subjects and countless tongues. But the empire's heart was beating slower. In the east, the Persians challenged its armies in Mesopotamia. In the Mediterranean, the Venetians and Spaniards had begun to reclaim ground once lost. Trade routes shifted, tax revenues faltered. The Janissary Corps, once the most disciplined military machine in the world, had grown complacent, powerful, and political. Beneath the surface, cracks formed in the structure of imperial power. Grand viziers rose and fell at the sultan's whim, and palace factions whispered in the corridors of Topkapi. Yet even in decline, the Ottoman Empire remained formidable. Its soldiers, artisans, and administrators still commanded resources that dwarfed those of most European states. Its armies could still crush lesser foes. It was within this environment that Kara Mustafa Pasha, the empire's Grand Vizier, saw his chance to make history. Appointed by Sultan Mehmed IV, he carried the weight of expectation and ambition in equal measure. He was intelligent, ruthless, and proud, traits that would define both his rise and his downfall. To him, the conquest of Vienna was more than a campaign. It was a mission to finish what Suleiman had begun, and to cement his own name beside that of the great conquerors of Islam. The political context of the time made his gamble seem possible. Western Europe was divided. France under Louis XIV was hostile to the Habsburgs, preferring to see Austria weakened. The German princes were wary of one another, their armies scattered and small. Even the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I struggled to command unity. In the spring of 1683, the empire looked inward, not outward, and Kara Mustafa saw that division as his opportunity. He began the campaign with grand ceremony. On the plains of Adrianople, the Ottoman army assembled under the imperial banner. Chronicles estimate 120,000 to 150,000 men marched northward, an enormous host of infantry, cavalry, gunners, engineers, and camp followers. The army moved through the Balkans like a slow tide. Towns surrendered rather than face destruction. By midsummer they reached Hungary, already under Ottoman control, and from there pressed toward Austria. For the Ottomans, this was a war of destiny as much as of politics. Preachers in the ranks framed it as a jihad, a sacred struggle to carry Islam deeper into Europe. In Constantinople, prayers were offered for the victory of the Sultan's standard. The vizier himself carried the banner of the Prophet Muhammad, a relic venerated as a divine sign of legitimacy. To Kara Mustafa, that banner symbolized not just faith but inevitability. The Habsburg world watched with mounting dread. When news reached Vienna that the Ottoman army had crossed the Raba River, panic spread through the city. Emperor Leopold fled with his court, leaving the defense to local commanders. Citizens fortified gates and hoarded supplies. Churches filled with refugees. Yet the Ottomans advanced methodically, confident and disciplined. Their engineers measured the ground around Vienna, choosing sites for artillery and entrenchments. By early July 1683, the city was surrounded. The siege began. Kara Mustafa's army erected a vast encampment on the plains, a city of tents stretching for miles along the Danube. Inside its heart stood his command pavilion, a structure of silk and brocade, larger than some European palaces. There, he planned the methodical reduction of Vienna. But his intentions were not what most generals would have chosen. Unlike earlier Ottoman commanders who preferred quick assaults to overwhelm fortresses, Kara Mustafa wanted Vienna intact. He envisioned the city as a jewel, a new capital of Ottoman Europe, to be offered to the Sultan in pristine condition. He ordered his artillery to spare the great churches and palaces. He forbade plundering. He wanted a city that could be governed, not ruins that had to be rebuilt. It was a decision that revealed both his vanity and his fatal miscalculation. A full bombardment might have crushed Vienna within weeks. A relentless storming could have overwhelmed the defenders before help could gather. Instead, Kara Mustafa chose a slow siege, a contest of endurance, where hunger and fear would wear the city down. He believed he had time. But time was not his ally. The longer the siege lasted, the further his supply lines stretched. The Ottoman army's food, fodder, and powder had to be hauled across hundreds of kilometers from the Balkans. Each passing week drained resources. And while the vizier dug trenches and raised siege lines, he failed to see what his caution had set in motion. Beyond the hills, messages were already being carried to Poland and the German states. The Pope's emissaries were negotiating alliances. And the King of Poland, John III Sobieski, was preparing to ride. The Grand Vizier could not have known it, but in choosing patience over speed, he had given his enemies the one thing a besieged Europe needed most: time to unite. The army that surrounded Vienna in the summer of 1683 was unlike any other in Europe. It was a living empire on the march, tens of thousands of men drawn from every province under the Ottoman crescent. At its core were the Janissaries, elite infantry trained from childhood within the strict discipline of the Sultan's household troops. Once feared as the most professional soldiers in the world, they were equipped with muskets, short swords, and the confidence of generations of victory. Their ranks were accompanied by the Sipahi, heavy cavalrymen granted land in exchange for lifelong military service. To European eyes, these mailed horsemen, mounted on powerful Anatolian steeds, embodied the empire's might. Beyond them rode the Crimean Tatars, allies renowned for their speed and ferocity. They acted as scouts and raiders, sweeping far ahead of the main army to cut supply lines and terrorize villages. Behind them came artillery convoys and wagon trains that stretched for miles, carts loaded with gunpowder, cannonballs, food, and tools for siege works. Chroniclers recorded up to 300 cannon drawn by oxen and horses. This was not a mere army, it was a mobile civilization moving north across the plains of Hungary. But the grandeur of numbers concealed fragility. Every soldier, every horse, every weapon required constant supply. The Ottoman logistical system had to sustain roughly 150,000 men and 60,000 animals. Historians estimate that feeding such a force demanded over 800 tons of grain and fodder each week. Grain and powder were hauled from depots in Buda and Belgrade by endless chains of wagons and riverboats. Yet as the army advanced farther from its bases, the line of transport stretched dangerously thin. Each mile consumed time and manpower. Every delay allowed disease, desertion, and hunger to gnaw at the force. Still, in those early weeks, morale ran high. The vast camp was divided into ordered sectors: Janissaries near the command tents, cavalry farther out, and the artisans and traders who followed Ottoman armies everywhere. There were blacksmiths, cooks, tailors, and scribes. Even musicians played in the evenings. It looked, from a distance, like a city born from canvas and smoke. Kara Mustafa believed his methodical siege would demonstrate Ottoman precision and divine favor. He ordered his engineers, men who had mastered the craft of European-style fortification, to begin the work. The siege of Vienna followed the classical principles of 17th-century warfare: parallels, trenches, mines, and artillery lines. First came the parallels, trenches dug in a zigzag pattern to protect advancing troops from enemy fire. From these, Ottoman sappers crept closer each night, spading through earth while defenders above fired muskets and dropped grenades. As the parallels neared the bastions, miners went underground, tunneling beneath Vienna's outer walls. They packed the tunnels with barrels of gunpowder. When detonated, the blasts hurled stone and soil into the sky, collapsing sections of the fortifications. By mid-August, several outworks, particularly the Berg Bastion and Lobel Bastion, were partially destroyed. Each explosion opened a fresh wound, and the defenders rushed to fill the breaches with rubble and timber. The sound of subterranean digging terrified the city. Many civilians swore they could hear the muffled hammering of enemy miners beneath their feet. Kara Mustafa forbade a direct assault. He wanted to break Vienna slowly, to force its surrender without losing the city's wealth or beauty. He ordered his gunners to avoid the great churches and palaces, directing their cannon fire instead toward the lower walls and bastions. His subordinates, some seasoned generals, protested, warning that delay would invite European reinforcements. The Grand Vizier ignored them. Each day followed a grim rhythm. At dawn, the Ottomans fired their cannon from positions along the Vienne River, shaking the city's foundations. By noon, smoke blotted the sun. The defenders replied with their own guns, smaller in number but better aimed. By night, the sky glowed red from fires started by falling shot. The cycle repeated for weeks. As August wore on, the strain on the Ottoman camp became severe. Supply caravans lagged behind, ambushed by local militias. Horses died in droves from lack of fodder. Soldiers began slaughtering their pack animals for food. Foraging parties pushed farther into hostile territory, returning with less each time. Even the Crimean Tatars, once restless allies, grew impatient and unruly. Reports reached Kara Mustafa that some units refused orders or looted villages without permission. Inside Vienna, the situation was no better. The defenders were starving. Bread rations dwindled and the few surviving horses were eaten. Epidemics spread through the overcrowded city. The defenders patched walls by candlelight, using furniture and beams torn from homes. Every night, the ground trembled from new explosions as Ottoman mines detonated beneath the bastions. The once proud walls of the Habsburg capital now looked like broken teeth. The vizier, convinced victory was near, rejected all calls for compromise. He sent messengers to Constantinople proclaiming success was imminent. He imagined himself riding through Vienna's gates in triumph, presenting its keys to Sultan Mehmed IV. But as the siege lengthened, so too did the empire's exposure. Each additional day drained resources and morale. The slow pace that Kara Mustafa believed displayed his mastery was, in truth, inviting disaster. By early September, the trenches had reached the inner line of defenses. Ottoman engineers prepared new mines to destroy the last bastions. The defenders could no longer man all positions. Their numbers had fallen to fewer than 5,000 effective troops. Ammunition ran short. Food stores were nearly gone. Civilians dug wells and courtyards searching for clean water. Within the city, despair turned to fatalism. Outside the walls, Kara Mustafa stood beneath the green banner, confident that the end was only days away. His officers waited for his command to launch the final assault, but he hesitated once more. Perhaps pride, perhaps caution, perhaps a belief that the city would surrender without further bloodshed. He could not see beyond the horizon, where scouts had already begun to vanish. He did not yet know that the armies of the Holy League were gathering in the forest to the west. As the sun set on the 9th week of the siege, the trenches lay only meters from Vienna's walls. Powder charges were set. The next blast, the Ottomans believed, would open the city at last. But deep inside those hills, horsemen were marching. Their banners bore the image of an eagle and a cross, and their commander had sworn to reach Vienna before it fell. The Grand Vizier's measured patience had turned into a trap of his own making. The breaches were widening, and Vienna's last loaves were gone. If you've followed the siege this far, you can feel the tension tightening. The walls are breaking, but so is the empire that built them. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale, and never miss the moments when history itself stands on the edge, because what comes next will decide the fate of Europe. Inside the battered walls of Vienna, life had narrowed to the width of a bastion. Every sound carried meaning, the dull rhythm of shovels, the whistle of cannonballs, the faint grinding below that told of Ottoman miners working somewhere in the dark. For 2 months, the defenders had lived between explosions. The once elegant streets were now trenches, the squares turned to makeshift hospitals, and the city that had been the Habsburg crown's jewel became a fortress built on endurance. At the center of it all stood Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, commander of the garrison. Barely in his 30s, wounded early in the siege yet refusing to leave his post, he was both soldier and symbol. His orders were stern, his punishments brutal, but discipline was all that kept the city from dissolving into chaos. Contemporary diaries record how he rationed bread by the ounce, forbade hoarding under penalty of death, and even had a soldier executed publicly for stealing food from a child. Starhemberg's resolve hardened the spirit of the garrison. If their leader would die on the walls, so would they. Vienna's defense force was a patchwork. Imperial regulars, local militias, foreign mercenaries, and even civilians pressed into service. Fewer than 6,000 men could bear arms by late August. Women carried powder and water, patched uniforms, and nursed the wounded. Priests moved along the ramparts hearing confessions, their voices drowned by the roar of Ottoman guns. Each bastion became its own world, a handful of defenders, a few cannons, and a constant cloud of dust and smoke. Every day brought new loss. The Berg bastion, once proud and angular, was shattered by mines. Stones rained into the city, burying houses in rubble. Burials took place at night in hastily dug pits, marked only by wooden crosses. A chronicler wrote that the air itself had become unbreathable, thick with smoke, disease, and fear. Yet still they labored, carrying bricks and soil to repair what the enemy destroyed. Hunger was the true enemy. By September, the city's grain stores were gone. Bakers mixed sawdust into dough. Soldiers boiled horse hides for broth. Cats and dogs vanished from the streets. Those who fainted at their posts were revived with scraps of bread soaked in wine. Starhemberg himself rationed his own meals, eating beside common soldiers to keep morale alive. When plague-like sickness spread through the lower districts, the dead were burned in great pits beyond the cathedral. Vienna had become a city of ghosts, yet within those ghosts flickered a strange resilience. Religion was both comfort and weapon. Every morning, the cathedral bells rang to call the defenders to prayer. Processions wound through the streets carrying relics and icons. Some chroniclers claimed to have seen soldiers fighting with rosaries tied around their wrists. Whether out of faith or desperation, the garrison believed their endurance had divine meaning, that God himself had not yet abandoned Vienna. Despite the misery, the city fought back. Artillery positions remained active on the inner walls. Though the defenders had fewer guns than the besiegers, they used them with precision. From the St. Stephen's Tower, spotters directed fire toward Ottoman trenches, adjusting aim by torchlight at night. When enemy sappers detonated new mines, the defenders countered with listening tunnels, digging their own shafts to intercept the attackers underground. Several times the two sides met beneath the earth, fighting in cramped darkness with pickaxes and daggers. Inside the city, leadership extended beyond Starhemberg. Civic officials organized rationing and medical care. Nuns converted convents into infirmaries. Blacksmiths melted church bells to cast cannon shot. Even the city's scholars joined the defense, recording bombardments, counting shells, and drafting messages begging for aid. These journals would later become the most detailed records of the siege, written by people who never knew if they would see another sunrise. As the siege entered its 9th week, despair and hope lived side by side. Some nights the garrison sang hymns atop the walls, their voices carrying over to the Ottoman camp. Other nights, silence ruled, broken only by the muffled thud of enemy guns. The city's leadership knew the end was near. Ammunition was running out. Medical supplies were gone. Yet every dawn brought one more day of resistance, and that defiance alone kept morale from collapsing completely. On the evening of September 4th, a rumor began to spread among the soldiers. A Polish messenger had slipped through the Ottoman lines. No one knew his name, only that he claimed the relief army was marching from the north, led by King John III Sobieski himself. Some dismissed it as a desperate tale meant to lift spirits. Others clung to it like salvation. Starhemberg ordered secrecy. He would not allow false hope to spark chaos. Yet by morning whispers spread through the ranks. Men who had not smiled in weeks looked toward the hills beyond the city, imagining banners glinting in the distance. One diarist wrote, "The rumor ran through Vienna like fire through dry straw. We dared not believe it, and yet we did." That flicker of belief changed everything. The defenders held the walls through another week of bombardment, fighting on fumes, sustained by the idea that help might be near. They could not see the armies hidden beyond the forests, but they fought as if they could. For the first time in 2 months, the people of Vienna began to pray not for deliverance in heaven, but for reinforcements on earth. And somewhere in those hills, a courier galloped toward them, carrying proof that salvation was on its way. You've just felt the heartbeat of a dying city that refused to surrender. But outside those walls, the greatest rescue in European history was already forming. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale, where every episode pulls you closer to the exact moment history held its breath, and then changed forever. Far beyond the thunder of the Ottoman guns, another kind of battle was being waged, one fought not with steel but with diplomacy, faith, and desperation. When the siege of Vienna began, the Habsburg Empire stood virtually alone. Emperor Leopold I had fled to safety in Passau, his army scattered, his treasury strained. The German princes quarreled over who should contribute troops, and many feared that helping Austria would strengthen the emperor at their expense. France, under Louis XIV, watched with satisfaction from the west, hoping that Ottoman pressure would weaken its continental rivals. In the midst of that paralysis, one man acted, Pope Innocent XI. To him, the Ottoman advance was not just a military threat, it was a spiritual crisis, a second invasion of Christendom's heart. The memory of Constantinople's fall still haunted Christian Europe. Innocent believed that if Vienna fell, Rome itself might one day face the Crescent. From his chambers in the Vatican, he launched a campaign to unite the fractious Catholic states. Letters went out to courts across Europe urging a new Holy League, a revival of the old crusading spirit under a modern banner. But uniting kings was harder than preaching faith. The German princes hesitated, and the emperor lacked money. Only one ruler answered with decisive clarity, John III Sobieski, king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Sobieski was no ordinary monarch. A veteran soldier, he had spent much of his reign defending his borders from Ottoman and Tatar incursions. He was both brilliant and pragmatic, a man of intellect and iron. His victories at Khotan and other battles had already earned him fame as a defender of Christendom. But by 1683 his power at home was fragile. The Polish nobility, jealous of royal authority, limited his control through the parliament. The treasury was empty, and internal factions debated whether Poland should risk war on behalf of Austria. The Pope's envoys arrived in Krakow with offers of gold, indulgences, and glory. They promised that fighting for Vienna would sanctify Sobieski's reign, uniting his people under a sacred cause. Yet even that required persuasion. The Sejm resisted funding an expedition that would drain Polish coffers and risk thousands of lives. In the end, Sobieski made the decision himself. He would go to Vienna, with or without parliamentary approval. To pay for the campaign, he mortgaged his own estates and advanced personal funds to equip his army. That act alone changed the course of history. Without Sobieski's private wealth and conviction, no relief army would have reached Vienna in time. His army was small compared to the Ottoman host. Barely 27,000 men, including the legendary winged hussars, whose plumed armor and long lances would soon earn immortal fame. Yet those men were the finest cavalry in Europe, drilled for decisive shock warfare. By August 15, Sobieski's forces began their march. The king rode at the head of his columns, his banners bearing the Virgin Mary. Behind him followed detachments of German and Austrian allies who had rallied under his command. But coalition warfare was never simple. The Holy Roman Empire had its own generals, led by Charles of Lorraine, who had been fighting the Ottomans in Hungary. Dozens of German princes sent smaller contingents, each loyal only to its own ruler. The papal legates worked tirelessly to keep them united. Before the armies joined, a question arose that could have destroyed the alliance before it began. Who would command the combined force? By rank, the emperor's generals outranked Sobieski. But by prestige and experience, the Polish king was unmatched. Diplomacy, faith, and timing settled the matter. Leopold I, grateful for Sobieski's intervention, accepted him as supreme commander. The official declaration named Sobieski commander-in-chief of the Allied forces of Christendom. For the first time, Polish, German, and Austrian troops would fight under a single plan. The march toward Vienna was a masterpiece of secrecy and speed. Instead of advancing along the open roads that the Ottomans controlled, Sobieski chose a hidden path through the Vienna woods. It was a decision made against the advice of many subordinates, who feared the narrow, twisting trails would slow the army. But Sobieski understood terrain. He knew that approaching from the wooded ridges would conceal the size and position of his forces until the final moment. If the Ottomans saw them coming too soon, Vienna would fall before the relief army could arrive. The journey was brutal. Wagons overturned in the mud, artillery pieces were dragged by hand, and the soldiers slept beneath trees in the cold September rain. But morale held firm. Letters written by Polish officers described the march as a pilgrimage. "Every mile is a prayer, every hardship a penance," one wrote. By early September the coalition reached the Danube, then crossed to the western bank near Tulln. From there they advanced under cover of night toward the Kahlenberg Ridge, the high ground overlooking Vienna. Scouts reported that the Ottomans had no idea such a large army was so close. Their sentries watched only the city walls, confident that no relief could possibly arrive. Sobieski's gamble had worked. His decision to move through the forest would change the shape of the coming battle. The Ottomans believed time was theirs. In truth, it was slipping away. As the Allied army assembled on the ridges above Vienna, priests celebrated Mass at dawn. Soldiers sharpened swords and lances, fastening rosaries to their belts. From that height, they could see the smoke rising from the besieged city. The end was near, but whose end no one yet knew. The fate of Europe would now hinge on one man's daring march through the woods. What you've heard so far is only the prelude. The armies are in motion, hidden under the canopy, their footsteps echoing toward destiny. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale and stay for the moment when faith, strategy, and courage collide. When John III Sobieski descends from the hills to change the course of history. The road to Vienna was hidden beneath the trees. Through the dense, twisting paths of the Vienna woods, the Allied army crept forward, an army of exhaustion and faith. Horses stumbled on wet roots, wheels snapped in the mud, and men slept standing beside their wagons. Yet King John III Sobieski pressed them on. Every delay meant another day of bombardment for the city below. The Vienna woods were both shield and trial. This thick belt of forest stretched west of the city, rising into steep ridges that overlooked the plains. The Ottomans had camped east of those hills, focusing all their defenses toward the city. They believed no army would dare cross the forest behind them, especially not one burdened with cannon and supply trains. Sobieski understood that miscalculation better than anyone. He divided his army into columns that wound through narrow tracks under cover of darkness. Local Austrian peasants and foresters served as guides, leading cavalry and infantry by lantern light through ravines and streams. Communication was nearly impossible, messages passed by runners, written on scraps of parchment. But silence was essential. The Ottomans had scouts everywhere on the open plains. If they detected movement in the hills, Vienna might fall before the Allies could even form ranks. Food was scarce and water scarcer still. Horses were fed handfuls of cut grass. Soldiers marched in worn boots or bare feet, their armor dull with dust. Yet the morale remained unbroken. They could hear, faintly through the trees, the dull rumble of Ottoman cannon, the siege still raging. Each thunderclap reminded them why they marched. As the coalition crept closer, intelligence became the lifeline between the hills and the doomed city. Within Vienna, a handful of brave men risked everything to carry messages through enemy lines. The most famous of them was Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, a Polish merchant who spoke fluent Turkish. According to several chronicles, Kulczycki disguised himself in Ottoman clothing, slipping through the siege lines under cover of darkness. He carried news from the defenders to Sobieski's scouts, confirmation that the city still held, though barely. Some accounts claim he made more than one run, crossing the lines repeatedly while pretending to be a Turkish interpreter. Historians still debate the full accuracy of these tales. Some were likely embellished later, turning the merchant into a legend. Yet whether one man or many couriers like him made the difference between coordination and catastrophe. By the 8th of September, the first Allied units emerged from the forest near the Kahlenberg Ridge, overlooking the vast Ottoman camp below. From that height, the soldiers could finally see the scale of the siege, an enormous tent city stretching along the Danube and the Vienne River, smoke curling from thousands of campfires. The view stunned even veterans. The Ottoman camp was a marvel of order and magnitude. In its center rose Kara Mustafa Pasha's pavilion, a structure draped in silk and guarded by elite janissaries. Around it sprawled miles of tents, the cavalry quarters, artillery lines, markets, and forges. The entire plain shimmered with banners, horses, and artillery pieces. But the vizier's focus on Vienna had left one fatal weakness. His rear defenses, facing the forested ridges, were thin. Sobieski's officers studied the terrain carefully. To their right lay Leopoldsburg, another ridge that overlooked the western approach. Between those heights ran a series of open meadows where cavalry could gather unseen until the moment of descent. The plan began to take shape. The Imperial and German infantry would attack from the center and left, pinning the Ottomans against the city walls, while Sobieski's Polish cavalry would sweep down from the high ground in a single crushing charge. But to succeed, the attack had to be timed perfectly. If they struck too soon, the Ottomans might redeploy and crush the smaller Allied contingents piecemeal. Too late, and Vienna's walls would fall before the charge ever began. Coordination across such a vast front, with armies speaking 5 different languages, required almost impossible precision. On the night of September 11th, the campfires on the ridges burned low. The men whispered prayers, oiling muskets and tightening saddle straps. Priests moved among them, blessing regiments and offering absolution. Below, unaware of what was coming, the Ottomans continued their work, digging trenches, loading cannons, preparing for the final breach. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight struck the Danube. A mist hung over the plain, blurring the massive Ottoman encampment. Sobieski stood beside his officers on the ridge, scanning the enemy's rear lines through a spyglass. What he saw confirmed his intuition. The vizier had turned his army toward the city, not toward the hills. The trap was ready. The men in the forest had reached their places. On the ridges of Kahlenberg and Leopoldsburg, tens of thousands waited in silence. The hammer raised, waiting for the anvil to hold. The fog was lifting. The riders took their places. The world was about to hear thunder from the hills. You've seen the stage set and the players hidden in shadow, but what happens next will echo through centuries. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale and stay as history's greatest cavalry charge prepares to descend. The story is about to explode. September 12, 1683. The morning broke warm and windless, the sky veiled in haze. From the heights of Kahlenberg, the Allied army gazed down upon the Ottoman camp, a sea of tents, banners and smoke stretching to the horizon. Below them, the siege lines wrapped tight around Vienna's broken walls. It was the 61st day of the siege, and the city's fate would be decided before nightfall. At dawn, the Allied infantry began to move. The Austrians and Bavarians advanced first, descending through the woods in disciplined ranks. Drums beat a slow march, answered by the crack of muskets as Ottoman sentries spotted their movement. By mid-morning, the forest edge erupted in gunfire. The battle had begun. The Holy League's plan was deliberate. Their infantry would pin the Ottoman army in place, forcing it to face west, away from the city, while Sobieski's cavalry massed unseen on the ridges for the killing blow. The fighting was brutal and confused. Bavarian troops stormed the redoubts north of the Vienne River, while Saxon and Imperial soldiers engaged Janissary lines near the center. Cannon smoke rolled across the valley, mixing with the dust of shattered earthworks. 4 hours the Allies pushed slowly forward, step by step. The ground was steep and uneven. Each ridge captured revealed another slope beyond. Ottoman artillery answered fiercely, hurling iron and fire into the woods. Yet for all their numbers the defenders were disorganized. Kara Mustafa had stretched his army across too wide a front, half facing Vienna, half scrambling to meet this new threat. By noon, the Allied left wing had joined battle with the Ottomans near the villages of Nussdorf and Heiligenstadt. The noise was deafening, volleys of musket fire, the thunder of cannons, the cries of men and horses. Despite the chaos, the Allied commanders kept their nerve. Every minute the infantry held the line was another minute for Sobieski to prepare the final strike. On the ridges behind them, 18,000 cavalrymen formed into columns. Polish winged hussars, Austrian cuirassiers and German horsemen lined up side by side. The hussars stood out, tall men clad in gleaming armor, their lances tipped with steel, their horses restless beneath them. Behind their backs rose the distinctive wooden frames of feathers, sweeping outward like wings. They were more than decoration. They symbolized defiance, a promise that these riders would not retreat. Sobieski rode among them, inspecting formations, giving brief orders. His plan was simple and devastating. When the Ottoman lines were fully engaged and weakened by the infantry assault, his cavalry would charge down the slopes of Kahlenberg and Leopoldsburg, a descent of nearly 2 miles, and strike the center of the enemy camp with unstoppable force. The timing had to be perfect. By late afternoon, the signal was given. Church bells rang from the Allied ranks, echoing over the battlefield, the moment of release. At roughly 6 p.m. Sobieski raised his sword. Thousands of hooves tore into the earth. The greatest cavalry charge in European history began. The hillside thundered like a living storm. The hussars led the descent, their lances leveled, the feathers at their backs rippling in the wind. Behind them thundered the Imperial and Bavarian cavalry, each wave gaining speed as they plunged downward. The air filled with the roar of hooves and shouted prayers. Dust rose in clouds, turning daylight to smoke. Ottoman artillery fired wildly, but the gunners had little time. The charge struck like lightning. The first ranks of Janissaries broke under the impact, the Allied cavalry punching holes through the Ottoman center. Horses crashed into tents and wagons. Cannon crews were cut down before they could reload. Within minutes, order disintegrated. The Ottomans fought bravely, but the shock was too great. Sobieski himself led the final push toward Kara Mustafa's pavilion. The Polish king's banner, a white eagle on crimson, was seen cutting through the chaos. Witnesses later claimed he reached the vizier's command tents by sunset, his horse spattered with dust and blood. The Ottoman camp, once disciplined and orderly, dissolved into panic. Animals broke loose, wagons overturned, and men fled in every direction. Artillery lines collapsed. The Crimean Tatars on the flanks rode off in confusion, unwilling to die in a lost battle. Kara Mustafa tried to rally his janissaries near the center, but even his personal guard could not stem the tide. Seeing the banner of the Prophet nearly captured, he ordered a retreat, too late. By 7 p.m., the Ottoman army was in full flight toward the Danube. Thousands were cut down as they ran. The sun dipped behind the ridges, casting long shadows over the field. Vienna's defenders, watching from the walls, erupted in cheers. After 2 months of terror, the city was free. Yet victory had its cost. The plains were littered with bodies, Ottoman, Polish, German alike. Fires raged through the abandoned camp, consuming silks, tents, and the vizier's treasure. The thunder of hooves faded into silence, replaced by the moans of the wounded. As dusk settled over Vienna, the smoke drifted across fields still warm with battle. The Ottomans were gone, but who would count the damage, and what did this victory truly mean? History remembers the triumph, but few remember the reckoning that followed. Stay with Disturbing Tale, and subscribe now. The final act will reveal how victory on the field became punishment in the palace, and how the fall of one man marked the slow unraveling of an empire. When the sun rose over Vienna on September 13, 1683, the battlefield was a landscape of ruin. The fields that had echoed with thunder were now strewn with the wreckage of an empire's ambition. Shattered cannon, overturned wagons, and the bodies of thousands of soldiers and horses. Smoke drifted across the plain from burning tents. The siege that had begun with precision ended in chaos. Vienna's gates opened cautiously. The defenders, gaunt and hollow-eyed from weeks of starvation, stepped out among the dead. Contemporary reports described them as skeletons in armor, survivors who could barely lift their weapons. Inside the city, more than 12,000 civilians and soldiers had perished during the siege, victims of shellfire, disease, and hunger. Outside the walls, the Ottomans left behind an army that had ceased to exist. Estimates of Ottoman losses vary widely. Some contemporary sources claimed as many as 20,000 to 30,000 killed, while more conservative military historians suggest around 15,000 dead and wounded. Thousands more were taken prisoner. The Allied forces also suffered heavily, though proportionally far less, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 casualties across all contingents. The material booty seized from the Ottoman camp was staggering: gold, silver, silks, artillery pieces, and thousands of animals. The wealth of the vizier's pavilion alone filled more than 100 wagons when transported back to Vienna. The victors divided the spoils according to rank and contribution. Emperor Leopold's forces took the lion's share, but King John III Sobieski refused personal riches. Instead, he sent captured Ottoman banners and weapons to the Pope in Rome as a gesture of gratitude. When the trophies reached the Vatican, Pope Innocent XI ordered Te Deum sung in every cathedral across Europe, declaring September 12 the day of Thanksgiving. In Poland, Sobieski became a legend overnight, the savior of Vienna, defender of Christendom. But the triumph in Vienna was not universally celebrated within the Ottoman world. As the remnants of Kara Mustafa Pasha's army staggered eastward, the full magnitude of the defeat became impossible to conceal. The vizier reached Belgrade with only a fraction of his once mighty force. Witnesses reported thousands of deserters wandering through the Balkans, some stripped of weapons, others starving. The news reached Sultan Mehmed 4 weeks later in Edirne, carried by terrified messengers. The Sultan's court erupted in shock and outrage. Kara Mustafa was blamed entirely for the disaster. According to Ottoman chroniclers, the Sultan's judgment was swift. He had been entrusted with the glory of Islam and had shamed it before the world. On December 25, 1683, Kara Mustafa was executed by strangulation with a silk cord, the traditional death reserved for disgraced high officials. His head was sent to Istanbul and displayed briefly as proof of justice. His fall marked more than the death of one man. It symbolized the unraveling of Ottoman supremacy in Central Europe. Yet whether Vienna truly destroyed Ottoman power remains a matter of historical debate. In the immediate aftermath, the victory did not end the war. The Allies pressed their advantage. Throughout 1684 to 1699, A series of campaigns known as the Great Turkish War unfolded. The newly formed Holy League, an alliance of Austria, Poland, Venice and later Russia, struck repeatedly into Ottoman-held Hungary and the Balkans. Over the next decade, the empire lost vast territories including Buda 1686, Belgrade 1688, and much of Transylvania. The peace treaty signed at Karlowitz in 1699 formalized these losses. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman Empire ceded large swaths of Europe permanently. Historians have long viewed Vienna as a turning point, the moment the Ottoman advance into Central Europe ended forever. In many Western narratives, it became the symbolic high-water mark of Ottoman expansion, the beginning of a long imperial decline. This view dominated 19th and early 20th century historiography, shaped by nationalist and Christian triumphalist perspectives. However, modern scholarship offers a more nuanced interpretation. Some historians argue that the empire's decline was neither immediate nor inevitable. Ottoman military power recovered partially in the following decades, and administrative reforms continued under later sultans. Economic networks with the east and south remained vibrant, and the empire still commanded vast resources. From this perspective, Vienna was a setback, not a collapse, a failed campaign that exposed structural weaknesses but did not yet destroy the state. Even within Ottoman sources, interpretations diverge. Some chroniclers, such as Silidar Findikli Mehmed Aga, attributed the loss to divine displeasure and Kara Mustafa's arrogance. Others blamed logistical overstretch and poor coordination, the very same issues that plagued European coalitions before Sobieski's intervention. The defeat, they wrote, was less about faith and more about failure of leadership. In contrast, European accounts elevated the victory into legend. Baroque painters depicted the moment Sobieski descended from the hills as an act of divine deliverance. The king himself wrote to Pope Innocent XI the day after the battle, declaring, "Venimus, vitimus, Deus visit." We came, we saw, God conquered. That phrase echoed across Europe, reshaping public consciousness. It was not just a military triumph, it became myth. Vienna's survival also transformed geopolitics. The Habsburg monarchy, once fragile and encircled, began its rise as a dominant Central European power. Austria absorbed Hungary and Transylvania, extending its influence deep into the Balkans. Meanwhile, Poland's contribution, though decisive, did not secure lasting political stability at home. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth remained internally divided, and Sobieski's later years were marked by domestic disappointment. His victory made him immortal but not invincible. For the Ottomans, the consequences were slower but profound. The empire's prestige in Europe waned, its armies increasingly defensive, its diplomacy more constrained. The symbolic shock of Vienna lingered in the collective memory of both worlds, one celebrating deliverance, the other haunted by defeat. Even so, calling the battle the end of the Ottoman Empire would be misleading. The state survived for more than 2 centuries afterward, enduring reform, stagnation, and revival in cycles. Some historians now emphasize continuity, the persistence of Ottoman institutions and resilience despite repeated losses. The empire's decline, they argue, was not a straight line from Vienna but a gradual transformation shaped by economics, technology, and politics. Yet for contemporaries in 1683, it felt decisive. To those who stood on Vienna's walls or knelt beside the battlefield that night, the sense of finality was absolute. Europe had been saved, the great shadow from the east had been turned back. When the Pope's envoys wrote to Sobieski weeks later, they called him the new Constantine. In paintings he was shown with sword raised, trampling the green banner of the prophet, imagery that would endure for centuries in Western art. But history's truth lies between the brushstrokes, a victory bought with blood, chance, and exhaustion. From papal halls to sultans' courts, the echoes of Vienna reshaped continents, but history rarely ends where it appears to. If you've followed the march, the siege, and the storm, subscribe to Disturbing Tale. The next story we uncover may change how you see every empire that rose and fell in its shadow. When the smoke cleared, the hills above Vienna fell silent. The great banners were carried home, the dead were buried, and the empires rebuilt their stories. But the memory remained, of a king who rode through the forest to face an empire, and of a city that refused to fall. Centuries later, the balance of power in Europe still carries the echo of that September morning. Whether Vienna marked the birth of modern Europe or merely a pause in an older struggle, one truth endures. History turns not on destiny, but on the will of those who stand when the walls are breaking. If you believe history is never just the past, that it lives in every choice, every battle and every empire's rise and fall. Subscribe now to Disturbing Tale. New chapters of forgotten truth await.